This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Glynn Tonsor, K-State livestock economist, starts the show with a cattle market outlook. He covers the market, cattle on feed, feedlot returns, and the meat demand monitor. Keeping the show moving is K-State cow-calf extension specialist Jason Warner discussing cattle herd supplementation and management of minerals. A conversation about snakes with K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts ends the show. He describes identifiers of poisonous snakes and how people can help manage them. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update from K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. Glynn, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Glynn, what do we see in the cattle market last week?
Yeah, this past week was, for the most part, up. We're going to break down the cattle on feed report and some other feedlot return numbers here in a moment. But just to summarize kind of how the week ended, AMS called fed cattle 5-area market at about 209. That's up roughly $6 last week. When you look over at cash feeder cattle trade, the Kansas prep market was called 3 to 10. There was actually one case I noted it was up $12 last week. A couple lots, just for example, 193 head at 642 came in at 359. And then a lot of 227 head weighing 866 came in at 281. Those would be flat or about $5 higher than some of the lots the week before. We ran this outlook over the board. CME futures contracts, April contracts specifically, Friday close was 207 on live cattle, up about $5 on the week. For context, we were at about 192 when March started. So, a full $15 increase in, basically 3 weeks there. April feeder cattle closed at 286 on Friday, up $3, and likewise up about $16 here during the month of March. So, before we transition from that, it was a strong week, both feeder and fed cattle markets.
What about for box beef cutout?
Yeah, and this was part of the pull factor of why those cattle were up, was box beef was up as well. So choice was $325 on Friday, up about $7 from the Friday before. Select was $310 on Friday, up about $4 from the week before. And again, what I think is going on in the wholesale beef market, like real narrowly the last few weeks, is sorting through some demand concerns, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But I think they've been offset by upcoming supply reductions. So on balance, we're seeing higher prices.
And you mentioned that cattle on feed report, and what did you see there?
This past Friday, USDA NASS released their cattle on feed report. For our listeners, this is a widely recognized report, one of many that USDA puts out all the time. March 1st, inventory was down 2%. That was pretty much on par with expectations, so no surprise there. When we look at the February data, we do get one surprise, or I'd call it a surprise, is February placements were down 18%, and they were kind of expected. The pre-report average was down 16%. So I want to pause on that one and break it down for a moment. The trade was definitely expecting February placements to be down. Part of that is days of the month. Some of that also was the disruption towards the end of 2024 on flow from Mexico into the U.S., particularly for southern yards, so Texas yards even more narrowly. We are expecting some months here early in 2025 to have fewer placements because at a minimum, the timing of flows of animals that were coming from Mexico has been disrupted. I'm interjecting that because over the next few months, it will be interesting to watch, particularly the Texas part of this report, is do we sort of make up for and catch up on that? So were those flows simply changed in timing, or is it an aggregate reduction? We don't know yet. It's probably somewhere between those two extreme statements. Probably a reduction, but not as much as it looks like. That's the point. But regardless, the February placement number being lower is another signal that upcoming supplies might be tighter than even we were expecting. And then February marketings came in about 9% below the prior year, roughly on par with 8% was what was expected, a reduction. But again, the fact that it was down a little bit more means we may have produced a little bit less beef than we expected. And again, my comment earlier on the supply side with the box beef, I think you can see how these are kind of adding up a little bit is we know we have a tight supply. Maybe it's a little tighter than we even thought. And then we're going to talk beef demand in a minute. But the supply tightness part of this story, I think in recent weeks has definitely been what's underpinning the strength in the cattle and the box beef market.
And before we talk about beef demand, what numbers are you seeing for feedlot returns?
Roughly in the middle of the month, each month, you'll find on Ag Manager, our feedlot returns, I call it barometer, so it's just trends in profitability, net margins that are expected. And I want to give a shout out, as I always do, to the Animal Science and Industries Department. I use the Focus on Feedlot survey data for that. So lots of the in-weight, out-weight placements info, and then I married up with Kansas market, so fed cattle, feeder cattle, and corn data to come up with historic returns and forward-looking returns. The part that people most like to look at is the forward-looking part, which is what you're asking me about. And we last released these on March 19th, so they're fairly fresh, consistent with the market. Positive returns are projected now through Labor Day is the punchline. Just to give an example, you and I are talking here in March. Closeouts here in March are projected to be plus $229. The way you interpret that in this report is each steer that leaves Kansas and that fits this scenario in March should have a positive return $229. That presumes they weren't hedged, that you didn't hedge before the animal was bought, and you didn't hedge grain as you went. So it's kind of a no-risk management situation that's being modeled. Those returns are expected to stay north of $100 and actually north of $200 in a few of those months until we get out to about September, and that's plus 27, and they are actually projected to turn negative in October and November when we're not expected to have quite as high fed cattle prices, but the much higher feeder cattle prices have caught up with us and put that margin squeeze in place.
And you mentioned talking about demand, and what do we see for the February meat demand monitor?
Yeah, so mixed bag would be my summary for the report in February. Remember, the meat demand monitor, everything's on our AgManager website. We put out these base monthly reports. When we look at February specifically, the retail demand data pointed to some weakness. So we saw a decrease compared to the month before on 6 of the 8 categories that we track. I will interject, however, that when you look back to the February of 2024, so instead of month over month, we look year over year for a moment, February 25 actually had higher beef, pork, and chicken retail demand than we had in 24. And that's important because we ended 2024 with a good demand story. On balance, that has continued. I'm going to play my hand in a minute why I'm concerned, and we can't take it for granted. But we saw some month-over-month reductions, but importantly, we still have year-over-year growth in retail demand per this measure.
The willingness to pay for retail is less. However, it is higher for food service. And how does that work?
Yeah. So quick reminder is everything we produce in this country goes through one of 3 channels. So domestic retail, grocery store for at home, domestic food service, so like restaurants, or export. And we're talking domestic, so those 2 other channels. But there is at times strength in one domestic market, not the other. And to your point, we actually saw some strength in the food service channel in February. So willingness to pay for a dinner meal away from home was higher on 7 of the 8 categories we track. The ones that were weaker were plant-based patty, and that's not new. There's been some weakness there for some time. If that trend continues, and you probably picked up on my voice that it changed, is if underneath that is foot traffic going up, right, to sustain those higher willingness to pays for dinner meals away from home. I hope it continues. It was definitely something we watched 2023 and a good chunk of 2024 was as financial sentiment became bearish, if you like, in U.S. households, they were less likely to go to restaurants. It's really important as the broader macroeconomic uncertainty is facing the country, how that plays out on its own, but specifically from the meat industry, watching foot traffic through food service channel is going to be really important to watch. And it was nice to see the numbers up in February, but hopefully everybody heard me as that's definitely one of the things I'm watching as March concludes and we move into April and so forth.
And something that is usually consistent is what's important when residents are purchasing protein, and has anything changed?
So we have something called protein values. It's a list of 12 things, and we ask what are the 4 most important, what are the 4 least important when you make a protein purchasing decision. And we regularly see taste and freshness lead in that discussion, and we regularly see things like environmental impact and origin and traceability rank quite low. And what I mean by high and low is if I say it's high, you're very likely to tell me it's a top 4, very unlikely to tell me it's a bottom 4, and then the reverse on the bottom end of this. The thing I'll highlight that's a little different than the past is price always shows up as the 3rd or 4th most important. So it's always important consideration, but it's relative, and all these measures are relative. It's a forced rank. If you remember that you have 12, you can only choose 4. So it's not everything is important in this exercise. Price has grown in importance since last year. And I'm going to interject that because my earlier comments about demand concerns, if you like, is the public, and we see a few things in the February meat demand monitor that point to the public getting increasingly concerned with inflation specifically. And if that's the case, the importance of price is going to grow in your relative importance, and we definitely need to watch that.
How are people feeling about their finances?
So we ask every month again are your finances better, the same, or worse than last year? Quick reminder, every month over 3,000 people are filling this out now, so it's a nationally representative number I'm bringing to you. And in February, 20% said their finances are better than last year. Now, that's great for that group. We would just like to see that be 60, 80, 100%, right? And it's never 100%. Don't overreact to that comment, but we would like to see not be the minority. What's important from the meat industry is the group that says their finances are improving is way more likely to tell me they had beef, pork, or chicken yesterday. And that's not surprising, but we report the number of meals, by breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and so forth. And all those numbers are quite higher if you tell me your finances are improving. The other thing we put at the end of the base report, and I kind of played my hand earlier on the inflation point, is we also ask folks, what are you expecting prices to be next month on 4 retail meat categories? And it's ribeye steak, ground beef, pork chops, and bacon. And at the end of the February report, you could pull up a chart, and there's purple bar charts for the February 2025. And I'm giving the color cues for people to pull this up. You'll see those bars are taller. The numbers associated with those bars are larger in this February than they were February of 24 or February 23. What that means is for those 2 beef and those 2 pork categories is the public's expecting prices to increase more here in March, given what they were looking at in February, than when I asked them the same thing in 24 and 23. Their own inflation expectations on meat are growing is the most blunt way to say that. I don't think that's unique to meat. This isn't Meat Demand Monitor, so we're focused on meat. But I'm trying to put a bow around this is the broader macroeconomic uncertainty, right? Discussions about GDP growth and whether or not we have a recession coming. Trade uncertainty is definitely elevated, and some of that just comes down to inflation expectations are growing. Concerns on that are growing. We need to watch that in the meat space because we've had a very good demand run recently, specifically for beef, but that should not be taken for granted.
Glenn, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me on.
That was K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. As always, you can find this information on AgManager.info. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Monday show talking about mineral supplementation and management for the cattle herd with K-State Cow-Calf Extension Specialist Jason Warner. Jason, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome, Shelby. Appreciate the opportunity to be with you as always.
For cattle producers, why this time of year should we be thinking about mineral?
Well, this is a really good time of year as we move into the spring season. And, when we think about mineral supplementation for our cow herds, it's a really important component of the overall nutritional plan for the cow herd. And certainly when we think about going into this time of the year, it's a time where folks are often reviewing what their plan is going to be for their mineral supplementation program and maybe making some decisions on that. And certainly when we think about, getting our program put together to be able to address the needs that we might have for that cow herd for the upcoming later spring and summer grazing season, it's just a good time to revisit it. So I think any time of the year is good to think about and discuss mineral supplementation, but certainly going into this time of the year is certainly important. One thing that I think is always good for folks to think about is that, if they haven't already done this, depending on what their relationship is with their feed service provider or what their needs are, it's a great time to be thinking about maybe pre-purchasing or lining up what their needs are going to be with their feed service provider, and just having that conversation with their feed service provider well in advance so that they know what the needs of that producer are going to be as they work throughout the year to help them make sure that they can supply the product that they're going to need for that upcoming spring and summer grazing season is really important. In some situations, some producers maybe have already made their purchasing decisions or maybe pre-purchased their product if they're able to do so for this upcoming year. But if folks haven't done that, there's still an opportunity there for folks to be able to do that. And so I would just encourage folks to be thinking about that, have that conversation with their service provider to see if there's an opportunity for them to do that, because oftentimes that will not only allow people to understand what their product needs are going to be and make sure that product's available to them when producers need it, but then also, too, sometimes there's an opportunity for folks to be able to save some money there for purchasing and discounts that their service provider might be able to offer them. And so I just encourage folks to be thinking about that, talk to their feed service provider about that and see if that's a good fit. Certainly also, too, when we get into this time of year, here it is early spring. A couple of things that folks are going to be wanting to think about is magnesium supplementation going into this time of year, and we know that that's important for preventing grass tetany or hypomagnesia, magnesium deficiency, and we see a greater risk of that condition when cows are grazing certain forages that are rapidly growing, and particularly our cool season forages or our small cereal grains, our winter or spring annual type forages. If cows are going to be grazing those types of forages this time of year, and lush, rapidly growing forages that have a lower magnesium concentration but a higher potassium concentration puts those cows at a greater risk for hypomagnesia or grass tetany, and certainly for lactating cows. So for cows that have got calves at side here this time of year, we see a greater risk there. And so just making sure that folks are being cognizant of that. And again, understanding what their levels are, making sure that they are providing an adequate amount of magnesium. And in most situations, for a quarter of a pound or a 4-ounce mineral, we're probably looking at something that's got at least 5 to 6% magnesium in it at a minimum. And there would be certainly some situations where we would want to feed a higher level than that, but just making sure that we understand what those levels are, because hypomagnesia or grass tetany can certainly occur, and it's a challenging condition, one that occurs pretty rapidly, and so we want to make sure that folks are being cognizant of that. One other thing that I think about also, too, for folks going into this time of year is if they're going to be using a fly control program, a feed-through fly control program as part of their mineral supplementation program, just making sure that you're proactive and getting on that or starting that product early in the grazing season and not waiting until the mid or the later part of the summer to introduce that product, because it's going to be less effective from a fly control standpoint. And we know that for all types of feed control, feed-through, fly control types of products, the data would support that the earlier we can start that, the better success that we generally have with those products in terms of controlling flies in our pastured cow herds. And so, again, that goes back to the importance of having the conversation with your feed service provider, of understanding the product that you're going to use and when the recommended time to start on it is. And early on in the spring is generally recommended there. So a few things that I think from just a logistic management standpoint as we think about managing our cow herds going into this time of year are certainly important.
As we're thinking about this, what advice maybe do you have for people when they're putting together mineral supplementation plans, programs, and especially things not to overlook?
Some of the big things that I really think about, first and foremost, just understanding the product that you're going to use. That's really, really important. We see a difference in products that are manufactured out there that have a very specific intended use, and that's important. And we want folks to make sure that they're doing their due diligence, reading and understanding the label directions, following those label directions, and asking questions if questions arise to make sure that the product that they're going to use is a good fit for their situation. We always get a lot of questions about supplementing cattle with antibiotics, with chlorotetracycline specifically, for various reasons. And so, you need to make sure that you visit with your veterinarian on that and to have a good conversation with them to understand that if you need to introduce that type of a product, that you have a clear, specific reason why. You have a veterinary feed directive put together and a good relationship with your veterinarian on that to be able to get that product into your cow herd if needed. And so, just again, having that conversation is really important. A couple of things also too that we want to make sure that we're thinking about is understanding that the longer that we hold product over from a shelf life standpoint or from a storage standpoint, the greater potential loss that we'll see there, particularly with vitamins due to oxidation of the vitamins. The minerals themselves are pretty static. They don't really change over the course of time. But what we have observed and what we have determined over the course of time is that we do see some loss with particularly our vitamin A, vitamin E sources that are in our trace mineral supplements and a lot of supplements that would be manufactured that would have those in them. And so just making sure that we recognize that, We don't want to try to be feeding product that's maybe left over from the last couple of years. Make sure that we're using good, fresh product and again, understanding what our needs are going to be throughout the year so that we don't over-purchase product and have a tremendous amount of product or excess product in inventory that we don't use that we carry over into the next year. So that's something else that's certainly important for folks to think about.
For the cattle herd, what are some commonly overlooked things when it comes to mineral supplementation?
One of the biggest challenges that I see with free choice mineral supplementation as I visit with and work with producers is understanding consumption and getting a good handle on what consumption is in our free choice feeding situations. That's really challenging, and we certainly know that we can see a wide variation there in individual intake and consumption from one group of cows to the next, from one pasture to the next, even on particularly the same set of cows. And so, oftentimes we'll have the conversation with producers that, we see a really high level of consumption of a certain product during certain times of the year, and then again, maybe a low period of consumption during certain times of the year. The thing that I'll go back to that I encourage folks to do is just do a good job of really actually calculating out what that consumption is and measuring what that intake is as you go, particularly throughout the summer grazing season. That's really important to just monitor your consumption because, if consumption is 2, 3, 4 times what cattle are supposed to be consuming, that's additional cost there. And conversely, when we think about feeding a medicated mineral or a product that has an additive in it, such as fly control or something like that, we know that underconsumption is certainly not what we want to have there in that situation there. And so just make sure that we're doing our due diligence to monitor and manage our consumption to try to get it as close to what it should be per the label directions for that product. And so just making sure that that we understand what the needs are there and working through that to manage that appropriately as best we can throughout the summer season. That's really important there as well.
What are some big things that have changed over time?
Some of the biggest things we've seen over the course of time have been the introduction or the use of different sources, particularly for trace minerals. And so we see our sulfate sources, we see our oxide sources used in some situations, but predominantly sulfate sources. But then also, too, we see organic or complex trace minerals that may be bound to an amino acid or bound to a protein source or other sources as well, too, that have increased absorption and increased bioavailability. And so, again, read and understand the label directions and understand what that product is formulated with and have that conversation with your service provider to understand the different sources that are in those products and what their intended use certainly is.
Jason, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
You bet. Thanks, Shelby. Appreciate it.
That was K-State Cow-Calf Extension Specialist Jason Varner. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show talking about something we've talked about in previous years, snakes, with K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Shelby. I know that, like you said, this is a repeat interview, but it's an important one because snakes are coming out of hibernation. They're hungry. They're anxious to get out of their winter cover and find food, explore the environment, probably look for a mate, potentially, if they're a species that's going to mate in the springtime, and then find a place to nest. And so they're out, they're very active. People are likely to encounter snakes. And one of the challenges with that is there's a lot of folks who are pretty snake averse, so they don't want to see them.
What snakes are in Kansas?
Sure. So we've got 42 different species of snakes. It is important to know that only 7 of those 42 species are venomous. There's 2 species of copperheads, so that makes it seem a little bit bigger. And then we also haven't detected a cottonmouth in Kansas since the early 90s. So really, the number of venomous snakes that we have that you're likely to encounter is pretty low.
What are the snakes coming out and eating?
Sure. So we have snakes that eat all kinds of different things. Lots of the smaller snakes would eat mainly insects and those sorts of prey items. We also have snakes like the king snake that eats other snakes and reptiles, and king snakes also eat other snakes that are venomous. So they're definitely a couple of species of snake that do folks a favor who don't like to see snakes. The vast majority of snakes are going to eat lots of small mammals. So they're eating native rats and mice and doing folks a favor that way too. But also birds, other reptiles, I think we already said, frogs and those sorts of critters.
Are people likely to be bit by a snake?
Your likelihood of being bitten by a snake is strongly related to whether or not you're handling a snake. And even when we're thinking about venomous snakes, over half the people who are bitten by venomous snakes every year are actually handling those venomous snakes.
Is there value in making sure people can identify what type of snake it is?
Yeah, that's one of the most important things. So if you are a person who may want to handle a snake or may decide to handle a snake, then it's really important to be able to identify snakes. And if nothing else, learn to identify the venomous snakes. So venomous snakes tend to have a very broad head, and so they have this sort of triangular or arrowhead shape to their head. The non-venomous snakes will still flatten their head out to try and mimic venomous snakes, but the big difference there is the triangular shape on the back of the head of the venomous snake is due to venom sacs. There's multiple species of snakes, venomous and non-venomous, that have keeled scales, which means the scales have a ridge down the scale, but all of our venomous snakes are going to have those keeled scales. Our venomous snakes are all pit vipers, and so if you're close enough to see this, they're going to have a secondary opening in between their eye and their nasal openings. That's that pit that is sort of a heat-sensing organ. And then they also have elliptical pupils. So they have pupils that are shaped like cat's pupils, whereas our non-venomous snakes are going to have round pupils.
What can people do if they're in their space, in their areas, their homes?
Sure. So when we're thinking about trying to minimize any sort of human-wildlife conflict, we can think about the acronym HER. H stands for habitat modification. So typically we're going to remove the cover that's attracting snakes to our yard. That can be tall grass, it can be piles of wood, it can be rocks, including things that might be landscaping. So if you're really snake averse, then you might want to have more of a sterile yard that doesn't have lots of landscaping. E stands for exclusion, and so that's sealing up the home. And really remember that snakes can get under loose doors. Even a large snake can get through an opening that's only a half inch tall by an inch or two wide. And then removal, of course, is removing those animals. The main thing that folks can do there is, if we have snakes that are getting into a home, we can put glue boards behind furniture in homes, because snakes, when they come into the house, they tend to follow structure like walls, and we can place those boards behind furniture to exclude pets and catch the snakes when they come in the house.
Drew, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
That was K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.